now. As we begin the SLA New York Up Close and Personal Perspectives from Education Professionals and Academic Librarians, this event will be moderated and led by Ameerah Stafford. Ameerah, if you could take the mic.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's panel discussion called Up Close and Personal Perspectives from Education Professionals and Academic Librarians. My name is Ameerah Stafford, and I am the Associate Director of the Education Resource Center located at the University of Delaware. I will be today's moderator for the panel discussion. Clara and Lisa, please feel free to introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Clara Cabrera, the SLA New York Programs coordinator, and I'm being assisted on the tech side today by Lisa. Lisa, introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I co-chair the Diversity Committee for SLA, and I will be assisting today with the IT.
Thank you both so much. So before we begin today's event, I would like to begin with land acknowledgements. Can we each acknowledge the land on which we occupy in the chat? I will start by acknowledging the land on which I occupy as the traditional home of the Lenape Tribal Nation, also known as the Delaware people. And while you're doing that, just a little housekeeping. Please keep yourselves muted, like Clara mentioned, for not speaking. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat. I will be bringing them up again during the presentation, and we will also have some time for a Q&A or questions at the end of the discussion. I will be taking notes throughout the discussion and share them with everyone during the recap. So the purpose of today's panel discussion is to provide a platform for education professionals and academic librarians to share their insights on establishing library relationships in this new norm. The objectives of this panel are to describe the challenges and opportunities that library professionals face while working in this new norm. We also want to analyze some working practices in this new norm from diverse perspectives, and then identify practical steps towards rebuilding and establishing library relationships. So since we only have 1 hour, we will break the discussion into 3 chunks. First, I will provide questions for our panelists. Then we will take questions from the audience. And then finally, we will do a wrap up. So to get us started and help answer these questions today, we're fortunate to have 3 academic library professionals from Fordham University, Rutgers University, and Syracuse University, who work across the areas of library access services, subject and instructional design, and education librarianship. Now, without further ado, I will turn the time over to the 3 panelists who will provide us a brief introduction of themselves. And Nick, we can start with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ameerah. Hi, I'm Nick Alongi. I am the head of Access, Information, and Collection Services at Fordham University's Quinn Library at the Lincoln Center campus. I have 13 plus years of academic library experience here at Fordham, working in a variety of roles and supporting both on-site and distance learning populations. I have worked in circulation, reserves, reference, and in administrative positions. In my current role, I supervise the staff at the Lincoln Center and Westchester campus libraries with a large focus on instruction, access, and our ongoing controlled digital lending initiatives. In addition, I am a past president and current executive board member of the Waldo Academic Library Directors Organization, also known as Waldo. And up next is the wonderful Leslin Charles.
Thanks, Nick. I like being called wonderful. So I hope I live up to the expectation. I am the instructional design librarian at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. I am also the liaison to the Graduate School of Education. Librarianship is my second career. I was a special education teacher with focus on the hearing impaired student population, and I bring those sensitivities to my instructional design and to all parts of my professional and personal life. What am I interested in? Student engagement, metacognition, information literacy, At Rutgers, I work with the teaching faculty as well as librarian faculty to find specific and appropriate pedagogical activities for a wide range of undergraduate students. And some of the undergraduate population that I work with are previously incarcerated students, transfer students, internationals, traditionally underrepresented students. So a wide swathe of students I get to work with, which is a great privilege for me, not to mention honors. So you can tell the diversity of the students that I interact with. One example of my scholarship, May 2021, I co-authored an article with a professor from the Graduate School of Education in line with my liaisonship on transactional distance and embedded librarianship. And that was all for online learning. So it came out right in the middle of the pandemic. And one thing in terms of my professional career, I am currently a Fulbright scholar, Fulbright specialist rather, and I'm hoping to go to Turkey to accomplish that goal. And now to Giovanna.
Thanks, Leslin. I'm Giovanna Colosi, and I am the education librarian at Syracuse University. I'm also the lead for our instruction team. I work primarily with our faculty in building our collection and also doing one-shot instruction sessions. I also develop workshops for our graduate student population. And I am sort of fairly new to librarianship. It is my second career. I've been at Syracuse University for 13 years, but 4 years as a librarian. Prior to that, I was in higher education. So part of my liaison role, I do work with students who are looking to become higher education professionals themselves. So I have some background in that as well. I have been in admissions, student affairs, residence life, you name it in higher ed, and I've probably done it at some point. So melding my love and passion for librarianship and higher education, it made sense that I went for this position. So without further ado, I think we can get started with our questions.
Well, thank you all so much for joining me. Thank you so much, Giovanna, and the viewers online. Thank you. So let's jump right in. You know, at the core of what library professionals do is to help build connections and establish relationships with the community in which they serve. In many instances, it takes years to build library relationships. However, within a matter of months, the pandemic has threatened these relationships both in person and online. So my first question is, how can library professionals effectively establish and maintain relationships with patrons and constituents to provide a valuable service in this new norm? And anyone can jump in.
Well, Ameerah, you know, one of the biggest challenges is figuring out, is this the new normal? Have things really settled? Or are we still in a position of transition? Evaluating the services that we offered both before the pandemic and during it are, you know, a really key step in seeing what has worked and what we need to reinstitute when people are coming back to campus. Some people are still a little bit, you know, shy about in-person transactions, about interacting with library staff one-on-one. So continuing the remote services, I think, is a really good idea to kind of ease people back into this transitionary period. Not change everything back to the way it was, because clearly some things may have worked. Offers like self-service intercampus hold and interlibrary loan, offering more Zoom instruction for bibliographic instruction and orientations, having more cross-training because not everybody might not be on campus every week. You know, certain things we need to see how they worked, how they didn't, and see, do we want to keep going?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I'll go from here. So connecting with our partners, pre-existing partners, and then leveraging the existing programs that we had. That was one way that we were able to cope and make the quick pivot for the pandemic. So for example, in New Brunswick, every summer, we would have something called an Information Literacy Summit, where we would invite our partners, those programs, institutional partners that would work with us with regard to information literacy instruction, research instruction for undergraduate students. So one of our big partners is the writing program from the School of Arts and Sciences. And so it's hundreds of thousands of students, hundreds of classes. So, I mean, not like 200 classes, not like 500, just to put that in perspective. But this partner and others, like the Educational Opportunity Fund, we were able to invite to our summit in August, as everyone was scrambling to get ready for fall 2020, since we were all remote at the time. So we were able to leverage those partnerships, invite those people to the table, and then carve out a way forward, since everyone was scrambling, right? For us, us faculty, we had maybe 10 days to tell our deans how we were going to change our in-person classes to online. So that was one way that we were able to leverage the partnership, and in fact, leverage a program or a gathering that would enable us to continue along our path. And we're continuing to do that as we move back. So we're aiming for this August to see what we're going to keep. And in terms, in line with what Nick is saying, what aspects are we going to keep? What aspects are we going to discard? What are we going to create new as needed?
Thanks, Leslin. I found that our faculty were very flexible when we moved to remote work, more flexible than we thought that they were going to be. So much so that that is sort of their preferred method of meeting. Before, where it was a simple email and an email chain that could go back and forth several times back and forth, as you probably all know. Now, most of the time, we will just set up a Zoom meeting and get all those questions answered right away. So I found that coming back from the pandemic, although we're not quite out of it yet, we're still maintaining those Zoom relationships. And space is an issue on our campus. So sometimes meeting in person was never ideal in the first place. So keeping this sort of Zoom as an extra office has really helped out for meeting with faculty. And on the flip side, it's also helped out immensely meeting with students who might not be traditional students. So I work with a lot of graduate students who are currently teachers or administrators, and their schedule when they're off is the same time I'm usually off. So that would mean me having to work a late night, them having to work a late night, and having to meet on campus somewhere. Where now we can both do that sort of in the comfort in our own homes, and neither one of us mind meeting like a 7 p.m. on a Tuesday, because we're both home and we can sort of do that via Zoom. We always had that technology, but now it's become sort of, secondhand. So it's something of not a new normal, but of a normal. So I think that's something wonderful that has come out of this pandemic.
Yeah, Giovanna, that is actually one good advantage that came out of this, is it really did push some staff to become more inclined to use platforms like Zoom, Google Drive, shared work files, just because we had to stay flexible in this environment. And it's nice that, instead of having, a struggle to do a staff meeting during that remote work period during the pandemic, we were able to have a weekly staff meeting over Zoom. We had a bigger connection to some people on our campus and the other campus than ever before. And these are people you might work 10, 15 feet from, but you might not see them because the schedules don't line up. So it's kind of picking the highlights of what came up during that period and kind of holding on to what you think can continue to add value.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. So as an education professional and academic librarian, you mentioned some advantages and disadvantages. Were these experienced pre-pandemic? I know Zoom kind of helped, but were there any advantages or disadvantages that were not experienced pre-pandemic outside of, because in person, there's a different relationship than Zoom. So Zoom helped, but then again, it kind of, I guess, disrupted building those strong relationships.
Yeah, so I'll go. So I do believe that the pandemic has been a blessing and a curse, right? So we've all lived the curse, but then the advantage is that for me, with my organizational structure and many subject librarians, everyone in their own silo, and coming together at points to have conversations, like I mentioned with the summit, we all had to scramble, like I mentioned before, to find a way forward. And in that, having to have this forced conversation, people who had heard about online learning but did not have to have the time or the inclination to adapt or to adopt new strategies in terms of teaching, et cetera, to engage with the technology, like Nick is saying. I'm talking about library faculty in this instance. They were willing and able to make the pivot, to adapt to new technologies and to new instructional strategies, understanding online learning, understanding a course management system, leveraging different technologies within our platform of Zoom. So using the polling for active engagement, using the breakout rooms, et cetera, mimicking the active learning strategies that we would have had in person, and being able to adopt those, and even having conversations about embedded librarianship, which I had been talking about ad nauseum. So people, library faculty, especially in this moment I'm talking about, were able to come light years into more savvy, more current pedagogical practices. So that was a major advantage, as well as the ability to enable transcription in Zoom, whereas in the classroom, and this is very close to me, as I mentioned when I introduced myself, whereas in the classroom, you know, students, they don't have a front seat, so to speak. In Zoom, they have a front seat. And so they can turn on their transcription if they want to, et cetera. So I think that allowed us to be more sensitive to accessibility issues. It allowed the faculty to move forward in terms of their skill sets. And it also made us more sensitive to the taking things for granted. So everyone went home, and then people just assumed that students had stable internet and that students had laptops, or that they even had a space in their home to take a class and turn on their cameras. Whereas it might've been 3 of them in one room at different corners. So you get the idea. So sensitivity, we moved ahead. So those are some of the advantages that I'm really grateful for. And I hope that we can continue with this lens of how we look at online learning and interacting with all our students as well as our faculty as we move forward.
Leslin, I think also another advantage is just there became a greater focus on access during this period. And I think that was a huge advantage. You know, when everybody, like you said, everybody went home, there was a concern of how are they going to get the books? How are they going to get what they need to be successful? And in our case, I think this was a kind of push we needed to bring us into, you know, the controlled digital lending field. This is something that's been kicked around for some time. I'm sure many of you have read the white paper, but I really think it was the kind of crazy circumstances we were all in that gave us that nudge to be willing to maybe step forward and give it a shot. Something, you know, that may have seemed a little gray area in terms of copyright early on for those unfamiliar with it, but the more you vetted it, the more you spoke to your legal department, it was a reputable way to provide access to students. So because of the pandemic situation, we were able to jumpstart our program, get university backing, and just show students need their materials. This is how we're gonna do it. So had we not had the pandemic, I honestly can't say if we would have made that move as quickly and embraced the technology as readily.
Thanks, Nick. I want to piggyback off that about embracing technology. So our faculty we use Blackboard as a learning platform, and some of our faculty were hesitant to put in like learning modules and things into that platform, where then they were forced to. And now we're finding that our information literacy librarian really is getting inundated with requests. How can I build more content into my Blackboard? And it's a great problem to have. So that was one thing. Another thing that I saw was as we were transitioning to homework, I had workshops that needed to be transitioned from in-person to online. And we found that just the increase of participation in our workshops was like tenfold in some cases. So while we weren't able to offer like sort of the great freebies of the free food, come in, you know, get your tchotchkes at the door, but we were, you know, able to offer students more flexible times. They didn't have to hassle with parking. So they were more apt to sign up for our workshops. And so now we're sort of in a hybrid point where we're offering both in person for those students that are on campus, and then workshops that are online for our commuter and adult students. So I don't think that was something that we would ever have thought of pre-pandemic. So that's definitely one advantage.
Thank you all for sharing. Leslin mentioned something about silos, and as a library professional and academic educator, I wonder how we can break down those silos that sometimes we find ourselves in trying to build relationships.
Yeah, so those I'll go because I mentioned the silos. For me, we're so big. We have 40,000 undergraduate students. We have faculty that are focusing on specific populations beyond even what I'm looking at, right? I look broadly at undergraduate students. And so having those abilities to train, well, train is a strong word, but to have conversations about our profession and where we're moving. So beyond the summit that I mentioned, there's something that happens a lot in the UK. It's called a Teach Meet, and it certainly is, it's talking about teaching with technology. That's a focus, and it happens in the UK with great frequency. It moved into librarianship. It started in schools, but I've taken that, taken some latitude, and I have employed that as a way for us to talk. So we do have Teach Meets where we're talking about teaching, we're talking about information literacy, undergraduate students, assessment, and we're also talking about training our graduate students who are in the library program, how to train them in order to become academic librarians and to teach in our programs as well. So those conversations happen. Shameless plug, I just published on that too, 2021. So that has been a way, when we talk about Teach Me, the faculty, they conjure up what this conversation is going to be about. So it's giving us a framework to have a conversation, and it's sharing. And there's no sage on the stage. I facilitate, or someone else has facilitated. And so that's where the faculty can actually talk about common goals, common ground. We did not do it with the faculty. We did it with our graduate students during the pandemic. But again, the summit was the way for us to actually move forward. So having dedicated spaces, safe spaces, having dedicated times when we can talk about certain things that impact all of us. I think it's finding the common ground, the common interests. We're all academic librarians, but everyone has their own interests, their own scholarship, their own professional goal, and their own job duties. And so we need to find ways of where we can all connect with something that we're all interested in that's going to benefit a great number of patrons.
Where I work, we have several different divisions just within the library itself, and we have several different library physical locations. So there might be days where I don't see another librarian. And funny enough, during the pandemic, I got to meet, I think Nick mentioned, through staff meetings and things like that. We did the same. We had weekly staff meetings and then monthly cross-departmental meetings where I actually got to meet people that did work on the same floor as me that I might have never seen. And so that is something that we continue to do. We also, my team, we do instruction, but I make sure that we are reaching out to our other librarians, whether they work in collections or research metrics, so we can offer, say, workshops or instruction sections on those topics. So we can reach out across the aisle to those librarians where they have the expertise, but we have the expertise to reach out to our patrons where they might be more siloed and they're working literally with collections and books, and we're working with the people. And so we make that connection, and so we can benefit ourselves. I also because I was in higher education, I encourage my staff to, and this was pre-pandemic, but literally hit the ground and do some footwork and knock on doors of your liaison areas and meet these professors. And they still do that, although they do this now in a Zoom fashion. So you can find out what sort of research is going on in your liaison areas. You can find out what's going on in your schools and colleges, because we can become so focused on our librarianship that we lose focus on the bigger picture. So I encourage everyone, and I think a lot of us in the field might be a little bit more introverted than in other fields, but to go out and meet somebody outside of your area, meet somebody in another school and college who's not a librarian that fits your, your research need or your area. So you can find out what's going on beyond your four walls.
So Giovanna, at our institution, siloing it's something we're always aware of, but it is something that we have a large issue with, just because of the size of our group. As a fairly small library staff, cross-training is kind of required in terms of everybody supervises students, and we have a lot of duties that kind of just bleed over into each other. So, our big focus when we were trying to, think about how to keep people engaged and keep them aware of what's happening in other divisions, the staff meetings are a really great tool. I think it's also just shared emails and just reminding people that there is crossover between what you do. If a book is not cataloged correctly, then we will never be able to shelve it. We will never be able to find it. Reference will never be able to refer it. Just continually reminding both staff and students that we are in just one long chain of, library divisions, kind of building towards something better.
Yeah, and one of the things I've been pushing as well is looking at our large number of students as in terms of programs. And when we look at, for example, the Educational Opportunity Fund, these are traditionally underrepresented students, but they're in every school. And so when we look at a class like Are You Fit, which is a transition course for international students, this past semester, it was 700 students that are in every school. And so when we are approaching our instruction, or we're looking at how we're supporting our undergraduate students, if we look at it programmatically, we're able to pull in those library faculty who would be siloed because their students are also represented in these populations. So that's another way to get the people who are siloed and you don't get to see. Giovanna, really good point, that you don't get to see except through email or something. Although Zoom has helped with us being able to see each other more. So looking at large programs, veterans, transfer students, et cetera, that is one way to get the faculty involved and engaged in their own students, because then they'll see their students within this population. And then we can continue to talk about how to serve them in terms of instruction or otherwise collection, et cetera.
Thank you all for sharing. Are there ways to better market to constituents to promote the value that library professionals offer?
I think we should stop being shy about how amazing libraries are. I think we need to brag a little bit more, both to our constituents, to the upper administration. I think we really need to highlight the hard work that's done, because when something goes right at a library, you don't notice it happening. When everything goes right between the acquisition of a new book, the cataloging it, and all the steps in the chain of it getting from the order to it on the shelf, when everything goes perfectly, no one knows and no one sees. We are working behind the scenes to make sure people are getting what they need, but we need to, I think, be a little bit more bold about touting all of the work that we're doing, touting that when a pandemic hit, like I believe Leslin said, in 10 days, we adapted and we were ready to move forward. Our school had a horrible flood. There was no loss in service. We had 4 feet of water in a basement, and everybody still had access to the databases, the ebooks, and the journals that they needed. I think we need to kind of talk about more about what we're doing, and not just in terms of door numbers and circulation numbers, but about the impact we're making at the libraries by continually being a reliable source of support for both the academic and the administrative functions of the university. Groups like athletics, groups like development, they are big partners with the library, in addition to the standard academic department. So I think if we do statistics reports, maybe a little less numbers and a little bit more bragging about, how we are really helping support the university's mission.
We at Syracuse University, our libraries sent out a survey for faculty and staff and students, and we surveyed them on what they'd like to see the libraries provide. And so when we received the results, and then every time we hit one of those benchmarks that they asked for, we do a big spread. So we have it on digital boards, we send it out via email, we put it in our newsletter, like, this is what you asked for, and now this is what we're giving you. So, and you're right, Nick, because nobody wants to see a pamphlet full of statistics and pie charts. Well, some people do, but most people want to see, you know, what, that's great, but what does that impact me as a student, or how does that impact me as a faculty member? So that's one way that we did it. We actually got it sort of from the horse's mouth. We took a few years in some instances. So one thing that we got out of our faculty survey was faculty wanted a place to congregate as faculty in cross-disciplinary faculty. So like I mentioned earlier, space is a big issue on our campus. Even though we're a large campus, space is still an issue. So they wanted a space in the library where they could congregate and have soft seating and technology available to them, and also space for consultation with their library. So it took 2 years to create the space, to renovate the space, but we gave it to them. So we did a splashy, you know, sort of, you know, email and marketing, and hopefully, fingers crossed, when this is over, we'll do some sort of nice soiree where we can, you know, eat and see each other's faces. So I totally agree. I think instead of always just being sort of the numbers and giving out statistics on collections and, you know, that sort of stuff, we need to be a little bit more boastful.
Yeah, that's so well said by both of you. And, you know, I find it ironic that libraries and librarians are always ahead, always on the cutting edge, early adopters to technologies, et cetera, pivoting like I mentioned before. But then the perception by the institutional administrators and external constituents, it's still a traditional perspective that they have of us, of what we do. And so we need to get out of this box, if you will, that we've been put in, because we never belonged in the box in the first place. We were never in it. So I think working with our partners and finding their goals in their programs. So that's what we do. We look in the EOF, we look in their learning outcomes, and then we show ways that we can impact their learning. And so we are a piece of their assessment report. And so the libraries are becoming much more visible in that way. So we're doing our own reports, but now we're partnering and we are appearing in these different reports. So that's one way for us to market ourselves. And then these partners talk about us. We're going to talk about ourselves too, but we want our partners to talk about us as well. And also committee work is one way for us, committee work outside of the libraries, in the institution. So undergraduate research council, that's where all the different programs come together and talk about undergraduate research and opportunities for undergraduates. I am on that council. And so the library has a voice. So these disparate, seemingly disparate programs, disparate committees that are within the university, librarians need to find a seat at the table and taking multiple approaches to getting our work out there. And not to mention, we need to have a skill bank. We need to have a place where the institution and our patrons know what skill sets we have, language abilities and other types of skill sets, so that we can be tapped, or resources, we can be tapped as resources. For example, because of my background in American Sign Language, I was invited to participate in a really big program where MIT and Lingnan University and Rutgers were trying to come up with a prototype for a transparent mask for the hearing impaired. And that only happened because my director knows about that particular skill that I have and was able to say, hey, take one of my faculty. So if we have a bank of what we can do, because the average librarian has lived many lives, so to speak, and has so many skills that they can bring to the table, including language or otherwise. You know, people with dance background, etc., things that are not overt. So I think that is another way for us to really represent ourselves on our library web pages, which I think is lacking in a lot of areas. And a lot of institutions do not celebrate the skill sets of the faculty in that way, the library faculty.
This was all great. Thank you. I'm noticing the time. We're a little more than halfway through our a prepared session. So I wanted to make sure to ask the folks who are attending to please post any questions that you have in the chat. Lisa and I will be sure to assist in making sure your question is seen by the panel. You're of course welcome to ask a question. Just use the raise your hand feature that's in the reaction icons on Zoom. I do want to, get the juices flowing on this questions from the audience. And as a participant myself, have questions, although I know Ameerah has a bank full of things she could go on with this crowd. My question is this. All of you on the panel, Ameerah included, Ameerah, Nick, Giovanna, and Leslin, have a unique component to your environment. You all have as either as a focus or a component of your audience, educators, right? Schools of education. So how do you see yourself modeling your behavior for this specific audience of future educators in their future interaction with librarians wherever they go forward?
So currently we have our future librarians, right? We have our students who are in the library school and the School of Communication and Information. They're on our campus. And so we do employ them and we do train them for instruction, for information literacy instruction specifically. They do other things because we want them to leave as well-rounded librarians. So for me, I invite them to shadow in my classes, to participate, especially since we were on Zoom. They would run the poll, they would check the chat, and they would see how I interact with students. So as an educator, I model my instruction in these ways. And as an educator, I model my instruction by working with my fellow faculty members on active learning strategies that we can try. I model that in terms of this is how pedagogies are moving forward. These are some of the things we should be thinking about: culturally relevant or responsive pedagogies, et cetera. And so that's one way to actually embody that. When I teach, I try to reach the students in terms of, using, not using too many idioms, language that is more universal, for example, and not necessarily using mostly American slang. When I'm using examples, trying for those examples to be as broad as possible, using pop stars that most likely would be internationally known, et cetera. So in that way, I feel as though I'm able to model for my fellow faculty and for my students.
Yeah, here at SU, we have the iSchool, which has the School of Information Literacy, Librarian Information Science. And so we also employ students. I have a few graduate students that work for me, and we encourage them to shadow us for instruction sessions. So eventually they can do their own instruction on their own. And we also have things called iScholars. And these iScholars are students that we choose for full scholarships. And their focus is information literacy and eventually becoming teaching librarians. And we did this because our iSchool focuses mostly on what every library school focuses on and doesn't focus so much on pedagogy and teaching. And as full transparency, I am also a graduate from that program. And if I didn't have my experience in higher education and teaching prior, coming into a library program where I'm expected to go into the classroom, I would have found the program to be lacking in that nature. So we thought, what a great way to partner with our iSchool as a library and as teaching librarians to offer students an opportunity to become more versed in teaching. And so they come to all our meetings. We have sort of a canned program that they can learn from, but then we give them sort of the wings to fly, and then they can do their own lesson planning. And it's wonderful. And most of them, I think this is our 2-year cycle, most of them have gone out, and the jobs that they are finding have that teaching component. And where we found students before were petrified, like, oh no, I don't, that's one thing I don't want to do. Now they feel like they have the skill set to go out and sort of conquer that.
Everything they said.
That's great. Folks, if you have questions, raise your hand and we will call upon you. I do want to ask Leslin this specific question. Leslin, with your background working with a population related to disability and accessibility, what are things that librarians in the academic environment or elsewhere should be taking note of? I know on a large level, and you all discussed this, how the virtual environment has allowed for some accessibility, but that's not enough. That was kind of accidental. How could we be intentional in our interaction with our colleagues and our audience, our stakeholders, all the folks that have visible and invisible disabilities? It's a big question, so I don't expect you to have all the answers.
Yeah, thanks. I have been very hesitant to return into the classroom to teach with a mask on because of my sensibility to not every student is going to declare that they need accommodations, right? And as librarians, we go into the classrooms, we don't know what the accommodations are, nor should we, because it's private. So we are already at a disadvantage in that way. And so that's why, we talk about facing students and trying not to turn your backs while you're teaching, et cetera, right? So just so somebody might be relying on your face. And a lot of people do rely on your face, whether they're hearing impaired or not. So for example, people who don't speak English, we all have accents. People might be relying on your lips just to see what you're saying. And so this is why I was so interested in the Transparent Mask Project, where we could feel protected and still be in the classroom using a mask. So I've been, a little shy about going into the classrooms because of wearing the mask and because of my sensitivity to people needing to see my full face. So, and like I said before, this front seat that students tend to have in Zoom, I think it's a really great advantage. I think we need to go back into in person and, one shot and all of that. But I also think we need to continue to keep some of the strides that we've made. So for example, we can employ high flex teaching, right? So we could have students who elect to be in the classroom there, and we could have those who perhaps need to take a COVID test and still want to take class. They could stay in their dorms and still be on Zoom. So the professor could be in the room, the student could be in the dorm, and we could employ that kind of a high flex model. The issue there, of course, is the layout of the rooms, and we have very few rooms that are equipped for high flex because of the technological issues, the feedback on the Zoom and needing the microphone in the room for everyone who's speaking, et cetera. So those are some difficulties that are not insurmountable that we can employ. And so in this way, we would be as universal as possible. And then we could be even more creative. We could have the professor or the guest who is in Dubai and they don't have to fly in. We have this expert who could come in and talk using these technologies still. And so we would have greater creativity in our classes. We would be more inclusive in terms of who's ill, who has a need, who's not, et cetera. And so I think the accessibility question is not necessarily only for those who have disabilities, so to speak, but just for everyone. So that would be my 2 cents. HighFlex, I think, is a way to go, especially as we move back on campus fully. And I think one advantage of the pandemic has been forcing us to re-examine our spaces in terms of configuration, as well in terms of how we use them. So I would just encourage people to just be banging for this HighFlex model, because it's something that should be a part of our staple, something that we can offer our stakeholders.
Thank you all so much for sharing. I know we're running out of time. I wanted to do a real quick recap from what everyone discussed. We want to continue the role of services. If it's self-service, if that works, we want to continue that moving forward. Also, we want to improve on what works, and if it doesn't work, we want to find out another way to make things work better moving forward. Cross-training. We also definitely want to do more cross-training. Connect with pre-existing partners to leverage some partnerships. I heard that Zoom helps with meeting with students. It also helps making bigger connections than before the pandemic. In dealing with silos, we can use polling to find ways to have safe spaces and common grounds. We can offer workshops and make connections with different areas in the library. And we can also pull in faculty that may be siloed as well. In regards to marketing our services, we want to brag more. We also want to survey the campus and provide high quality services. And Leslin, you said also incorporate a HighFlex environment for learning. Was there one takeaway that each of you wanted to share with the audience, since we only have about 10 minutes left?
I'll go first. I think just summing up that while there was definitely some very bad things that came out of this pandemic, that let's not lose sight of the good things and the innovations that came out of it, and to continue moving forward. And sort of piggybacking on what Leslin said, like the HighFlex, like let's not leave everything behind. Maybe we can sort of meld the best of both worlds. So I think that's what I'm taking away from this conversation.
I would say, hold on to your flexibility. I remember a week during the summer when we all got rid of our masks and we're like, we're done. Who knows what the next thing coming down the pipe is. There's always going to be changes and challenges in academia and delivering services. It's, this has taught us we can't get set in our ways again. There's always some new technology, there's always some new way of providing access. And as long as we can adapt, libraries will always remain relevant.
Yeah, I just want to say how proud I am to be an academic librarian, because it just allows me to continue being the lifelong learner that I am. And it allows me to continue to be flexible, adaptable, approachable. And, I think librarians are consummate professionals, and the pandemic has brought that out. And as we continue to go back on campuses, I hope, to Giovanna's point, that we take what we've learned and we don't just go back to the traditional ways, with air quotes, things that we were doing. And I know that there might be a real strong urge to do that for many valid reasons, but I think we need to continue way ahead as we are now, as the pandemic has brought us. So I have great pride, and I have pride in being on this panel with my fellow colleagues here. So, I hope that you all feel proud of what we've been doing, what we've been able to accomplish globally as librarians, as a profession, despite the pandemic.
Thank you all so much. Thank you. It looks like I don't have any other questions. I wanted to reach out to the audience to see if they had any questions that they wanted to ask the panelists before we end our session. And if not, I did have a question for the audience. Were there any takeaways or anything the audience could use that we've talked about in the panel discussion today that they could use when they go back to their work? I don't know if you guys can type it, or if you can unmute yourselves if you want.
This is a interesting question, at least the way I think about it. The pandemic has been 2 years, and kind of a bigger picture, there's been a lot of changes in workplace environments where some folks have left the profession, and also you're onboarding new people in a remote environment to a large extent. What was your experience with that? Any key takeaways for anybody who's on this attending this event who wants to break into academic librarianship? I don't know about the panel, but myself and my environment, where we are paying attention more to what we're hearing the workforce saying they want. So hybrid accommodations, just being aware of that.
Well, it looks like we covered our questions. Is there anything else that we should cover before we wrap up today? If not, I wanted to say thank you to everyone. I want to express my sincerest gratitude to our panelists that participated in today's discussion. Thank you to the audience members for attending. Thank you to the members of SLA and DICE committees. I appreciate you so much for being here. And if possible, we would love to get your feedback from today's panel discussions. So I will put a link to the survey. And if you could fill that out, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you again for joining us today, and we'll see you again next time, everybody. Have a great one, and this session has ended.